Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Artsy Raven. Today, our special guest is Akemi C. Brodsky. Growing up in the Bay Area, Akemi always loved unassigned reading and making creative and unnecessarily complicated school projects. She graduated Magna Cum Laude from Brown University with a Bachelor of Science, then moved to the UK to do a Master's in Engineering at Imperial College London. She currently lives in the Bay Area and spends most of her spare time traveling, cooking, seeing family and friends, and watching TV. So welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself. You collect degrees. I sort of like to do the same thing. So after doing all these degrees, how come you decided to start writing?
Well, it was a sort of random story. I studied science in undergrad and then I did a master's in engineering, and I didn't feel like I wanted to become an academic, and then I tried something more practical with engineering and it didn't feel like the right fit for me. So I was going through a classic quarter life crisis, I guess you could say. Um, and I never really had considered writing growing up as a career, even though I always enjoyed doing creative things. And I was having breakfast with a friend of mine one day who he had studied English, and he was going through a similar stage in life. And we were just kind of like, what are we doing? And he suggested we should start this writing club where we write one page a week and we send it to each other and just see what happens and see how that goes, just as a sort of outlet right at that time. And I think we actually only ended up doing this for 1 or 2 weeks. But it turned out that the first week, the page that I wrote became the first page of the first manuscript that I wrote. So it's actually not the book that I'm publishing now, but it got me started. And then I really just fell in love with it and really enjoyed it. So
Okay, so the Brill Pill, that's the book that you finally did publish.
mhm.
Um, so what was the inspiration behind that?
So the Brill Pill, it's about a research scientist. Um, And I had spent a lot of time myself doing science in undergrad, and I worked in a lab during my senior year doing a thesis. And then I had a lot of friends who worked in labs and studied science, and my husband did a PhD, and I actually wrote it during the time that my husband was completing his PhD at Yale. So it takes place there. And I heard all these stories about people working in science, and you hope and imagine that the scientific community is like a bit, you know, above, you know, the sort of competitive things that sort of infiltrate so many different spheres of the professional world. And you hope that, they put science above themselves and that it's a bit more pure, intellectual. But in reality, like, so many people I know really struggled with it. So many people who are really smart, really dedicated, wanted to change the world. They started a career in academia doing their PhD, and it just is so competitive and so political that it really turned a lot of people off from it. And I think science itself suffers because of this. And so I think a lot of my writing starts because something is bothering me and I need to articulate what it is in some way. And it's not necessarily simple. It's complicated, so you can't just write it down and find a solution. But putting it into a novel format, I guess, which is sort of extreme, but it helps me to process these feelings. So with all these friends and my husband also in this situation, I had this spark to write something about a scientist.
Well,
And
tell
that's
me
how
a
it
little bit about the
started.
story. Yeah, starts off with a scientist.
Sorry?
Tell me a little bit about the story, like the
So
storyline.
it's a near future story, and it's a bit speculative. So the science in the story is a little bit more advanced than our science today. And it's about a research scientist who works with patients who have had brain transplants. So they've had some sort of brain injury or dementia or something like that, and they've had a brain regrown from stem cells and transplanted. And so all of these patients suffer from different side effects. Some of them have reduced motor function, some reduced intelligence, some enhanced intelligence. It's all kind of different. Some of them are just like sociopathic. And so the main character, this research scientist, he's trying to fix all of these problems. And along the way, he never really finds the right solution, and he starts to kind of hate these patients and fear these patients. And it's more about the main character and his journey. And he's a bit of an anti-hero, and sort of he's very arrogant, and he has a lot of hubris, and he starts kind of playing God and developing all of these experiments to fix this problem. And then you kind of see how it unravels.
Okay. Yeah, I did write a short story one time, like about mind patching, like, but in my story, you need donations from other people's
Mhm.
brains. So in
Oh
your
yeah.
story, where do you get the new brains or the tissue
So
from?
they're grown from the stem cells of the same person. So in theory, it's the
Okay.
same brain. But so that's part of his issue, is he like, it should be a transplant that works perfectly, but why are they experiencing these problems? So he's trying to fix this, and it's very frustrating for him. But
Cool, cool. Yeah, I noticed on your website, I'll have the link in the podcast notes. You list out a few projects that you're working on. Um, so what is your process for doing so many things at once?
so it's actually, they're not all being worked on at one time. And the Brill Pill, I actually finished writing it in 2017. And I spent a lot of time querying it before deciding to go with a hybrid publisher and publishing it. So like the first project on the page is probably the first book I wrote, which would have been even before the Brill Pill. And then the ones after that, I've sort of worked on since then. So I am working on usually one project at a time. But often I will sort of finish a manuscript, and I get to the end, I don't really want to look at it right away. And then I'll sort of take a break, work on something else, and then I'll come back to edit it later with fresh eyes, but more fresh eyes when I haven't seen it and just finished it and been thinking about it at that time.
So after you finished the Brill Pill, like what happened to the manuscript? Like you went back, you edited, you like did you query? Like who did you query with? Or
So I actually wrote it in a few chunks. So I wrote most of it and finished it in like 2015. And then I kind of got to where I thought would be the end, and I thought, this isn't finished, but I don't know what's going to happen next. So I took a break from it for probably almost a year. And then I finished it in 2017 and just added the last part. And I ended up very happy with how it ended, but I had no idea before that it was going to be like that. And then I kind of put it down for a little while and then picked it up again, and I edited it, just sort of reading through myself. And then my husband actually helps me a lot reading it with me, and usually out loud, which is painful, but it really helps to read it out loud. And he went through the whole thing with me, and we edited it together. And then after that, I started querying it, and I sent it, I don't even remember to who exactly, but probably to 20 or 30 agents over a period of a few years, just every once in a while. And I didn't get much feedback even. So I had spoken to a family friend, and she knew someone who published with She Writes Press, her memoir. And I thought about it for a long time, and I wasn't sure exactly if it was the right choice or not. But at some point, I felt like this was ready. Like personally, I felt that, and I just thought, I want to get it out there and see what happens. Like I felt like in some ways I just needed that feedback from getting it out there and seeing what people actually thought about it. And so I decided to do it.
cool. Now, is most of your stuff science fiction based because of your background, or do you write other things too?
Um, I write sort of a variety of genres so far. So this one, science fiction, it's, sort of hard science fiction, or mundane science fiction, I think is what a lot of people call it, lab lit. Um, but I have a book that's more coming of age, and then I have one that's a little bit like a mystery, and then I have a series that I'm working on now which isn't finished. But it's young adult, and it is also does have science fiction in it, and it's sort of a cli-fi novel.
So what motivates you to keep on going? Like how do you're like doing three, four different things at once. Like how do you organize yourself in a day?
I think I try to pick one thing to work on at a time. So usually if I start editing something, I'll be editing that for however many months it takes. And then if I'm writing something, I try and focus on that. And then I put things down for years at a time while I'm working on something else. And I think it would be really nice for me if I could work on everything like within even a week or a month. But I find it really hard actually to switch between projects and give focus to each of them. And this year has actually been hard because I've been focusing on publishing, which is its own project.
Yeah.
And so I haven't really been able to do much writing at all. But I've been learning a lot. So
So what are some of the challenges you face with the Brill Pill that you feel with the writing and publishing of this project?
with the writing, I think that what I said about getting to the end and it just not feeling finished, that was challenging because the way that I wrote it, I just kind of sat down and started it and I didn't know what was going to happen. And it's very character driven. So I kind of followed what the character wanted and their thoughts and feelings, and it kind of came out that way. But when I got to that point where I didn't know what was going to happen next, I thought I may never finish this book. And I wanted to, I didn't know how. And that was kind of unnerving. I don't know. So I just took a long break from it and came back to it and it worked out, but I had no idea if it would work out. And especially after spending so much time on it, it's, you want to finish it. In terms of publishing it, I think querying was a difficult process for me because I have no background in writing and I don't really have any friends who write in general or don't know a lot of contacts. It was kind of even learning, how do you query? Who do you query? Like, how do you choose which agents? And I don't actually know if I did it right or if there is a right way to do it. So the first set of letters I sent out, I thought they were fine. And then I read them like a year later and I was like, oh no, these are bad. I need to rewrite this query letter. And so that was a whole learning process in itself. And then really just coming to terms with deciding to hybrid publish was difficult. And I'm really happy with my decision. And it felt like compromising a little bit, but now that I've been through the process, I do feel like it's the right thing for me.
So what was the process like with hybrid publishing? Like you worked with an editor or
So with She Writes Press, and I don't know if every hybrid publisher is the same. You apply first, and so they have to accept you, and they read some of your manuscript and decide whether they're willing to publish it. And then they sort of walk you through the whole process. They do have proofreading included in the publishing process, but they don't have a copy edit included. And I decided to have it copy edited, and they helped me find a copy editor through them. But that was sort of not included, but additional. But very helpful to have a copy edit done. I'm not the best with grammar, so.
and then the publicity, do they do it for you or is that another option that you add on?
That's something that you do on your own. So you can find a publicist and they have one that they work with, as you know, which is Booksparks. But even with Booksparks, I think a lot of the pressure to publicize it is on the author. And my impression is that that is in traditional publishing too at this stage, like
Yeah.
unless
One
you're a
has the
really
money.
big title. Yeah.
Yeah, no one has money. Oh, yeah.
Exactly. So I've been just like trying to spread the word and talk to everyone I've ever known about it, and it's been a process.
Well, I mean, congrats. I mean, it's a big thing to bring to the world, right? It's like giving birth. Okay, Akemi, you're gonna read from your book, The Brill Pill. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to read, sort of set up the scene for us, and then read for us?
Yeah, so I think I'm just gonna read the very first chapter. So it gives you a little bit of an introduction to the character, mostly to the main character, William DeLaw. So here I go. Vicky was kind of a bitch, he conceded. More than kind of. He could tell by the way other girls looked at her, as if they had to swallow a tablespoon of honey before speaking to her. He didn't care. In fact, he admired her ability to fake such a disinterested expression over such sharp features. What he couldn't necessarily see was that she had drawn them in herself. It took about 20 different pots and pencils to orchestrate her face each morning. He would probably marry her. He wanted to marry her. But he wondered, in between these mental professions, if he could come up with even one really good reason why. He could tell that she was smart enough for success. But at the same time, he knew she would never bother to really support herself. It wasn't worth her time. Maybe it was her style that won him over. Even he would admit he wasn't above that. When she was all dressed up, she disappeared inside her #outfit of the day. And he was attracted by the small shiny objects that dangled from her ears and swept her thin neck. He still couldn't figure out why she'd ever agreed to date him. He used to be cool, he supposed. He used to be fucking cool. He wanted to know what their children would look like, what they would be when they grew up. But it had been that way with Ava too, and with Kate. In any case, he wouldn't see Vicky until the weekend. It was Tuesday, and the weekdays were for working. She lived in New York, that is, New York, New York, and he appreciated the separation. On weekdays, he had to focus. He lifted the pipette for the 100th time that morning, discarded the tip, and stretched his hand, extending his cramped fingers. He hated lab work. It was tedious, and it left too much room in his mind for daydreams. He didn't believe in daydreaming, but he couldn't help himself. It was his only vice, apart from vanity and excess of assiduity, and what some would call a drinking problem, and what anyone would call a quick temper. It was his only vice, in his eyes. Guten Morgen, Wilhelm. Just kidding. Hey, William. It's just Will, he said to himself. Yeah, Jay, he said out loud. Can I just borrow that one quick sec? Joe smiled and scooped a bottle of reagent off of the counter in front of Will before he could give an answer. Sure, borrow whatever you like. He nodded at the back of Joe's head. The three other postdocs, the three other people with whom Will spent virtually all of his time, were Joe, Jenny, and John. He referred to each of them simply as Jay, so as not to get confused. But he knew the difference. Jenny was the worst. Of course, he could never admit that out loud. There still weren't a lot of women in his field. Will was a forward thinker, though. Always had been. He knew it. He prided himself on it. But God, how Jenny sucked. She ordered expensive enzymes she didn't need. She left her food in the fridge for months. She booked lab equipment and then was perpetually late, getting her samples ready, so the time would go to waste. Worst of all, she was dumb as a brick, just plain stupid. And she wasn't even hot. Sometimes Will worried that the reason her food was left in the fridge for so long was that she had gotten it confused with the sample somehow, and either eaten the sample or was planning to throw the food into a centrifuge. He was pretty sure that was the only piece of equipment she knew how to use properly. Joe was okay. At least he knew what he was doing, and he was friendly besides, even if the small jokes and obvious cultural references were sometimes lost on, and more often ignored by Will. He often borrowed things off of Will's bench, but he always returned them, and Will was pretty sure if he ever found himself short of something, he could rely on Joe for it. But he was never short, and if he was short, he would go to the supply room and take whatever he needed. He didn't rely on anyone else. Except for the technician that ordered all of the materials, kept them stocked, and up to date. who also fixed anything that was broken, replaced parts, tinkered, tested, and tuned everything in the lab. Of course, that was his job. Joe had moved to America years ago to do his PhD, but he still seemed unseasoned. It was charming to most people. He was taller than Will and sportier. He had a lot of energy, and he knew a lot of people. One of those. John was his favorite, someone he could talk to about science and girls and sports, occasionally politics, everything worth talking about. And they had published some good papers together. That was good. John was stout, like a scientist ought to be. He didn't spend time playing basketball on the weekends, just watching it. He was from one of the Carolinas. Will could never remember which it was. And John had a family, a wife and a kid. The kid's name was Gloria, but Will called her John Jr., that is, in his head. Will joked with his PI that they couldn't ever hire anyone whose name didn't start with J. He suggested George be on the lookout for Jeffs, for Janes, for Jaspers. Sometimes Will thought that he really would have a hard time if a Fred were to join the lab, or worse, a Wesley. Thanks, dude. Joe was back to return the reagent. The sound of his Chinese accent forming American words, rarely used by Americans anymore, woke Will from yet another reverie. Anytime, man, he replied in kind and looked down at his work, realizing now that he had already finished and had lost minutes spacing out when he could have already been running the PCR. Fucking inefficient, Will. Yo, want to grab some beers later? Yeah, sure, sounds good. That was what was good about Joe. He didn't have a family to go home to, so he was always up for a drink. While the PCR was running, Will went to the library. It was a straight shot down the hall from the lab, and he often dropped by while he was waiting for an experiment to run. He generally didn't get much exercise, and, on average, it added another 500 steps to the day. Besides, if nothing else, it would keep him from falling into his daydreams again. The only problem was coming up with a good excuse to visit. On this occasion, he had one ready. Hey, girl. He was leaning over the counter and speaking to the librarian. Margot, can you look this up for me? Pretty please? He handed over a piece of paper with the title of a book he had scribbled down just seconds earlier. He smiled wide, but thankfully stopped himself just short of a wink. Margot squinted at the paper as if she were being forced to decipher an ancient scroll, but didn't remark on it. After all, if he had messaged her, he wouldn't have come to the library in person. Sure, William, I read this book last month, and I have a recommendation for you. She scribbled the title down on the other side of the piece of paper he had given her, and handed it back. I know you are capable of loading it yourself. She looked back down at the text she had been reading across the screen that doubled as her desk, letting her hair fall like a curtain in front of her face, even before she finished the sentence. Will knew he was capable of downloading a book from the library database. Of course he was capable, more than capable. He was even a little bit ashamed to show his face in the library itself. Barely anyone went in person anymore. But flirting with Margot was just an excuse to use her. Every time he showed her something he was interested in, she returned with 10 times more. He never left the library without a recommendation from her that was inevitably more clear and more thorough than what he had come in for. He figured she was marginally insane, because from what he could tell, and he had tested this theory, she had read every text in the entire medical library. Though he knew it wasn't possible, he believed it. He felt on some level that she must know more about his work than he did. Boy, was she clever. But she didn't have a PhD. He wanted to rub it in. Thanks, Ms. Margot. You're very welcome, Will. Dr. Will. He said it under his breath, but he could see that she had raised her eyebrows, though her head was still facing downward, resolutely into her reading. Want to grab a drink later? I mean, Joe is going, and he asked me, so I'm just extending. He raised a hand, palm up, in her direction. Margot hesitated before briefly looking up at him. "Thank you, but I have some reading to catch up on." And she was suddenly fully refocused on the journal she still had open on her desk, the horizontal screen casting light under her chin and reflecting off of the glasses that Will noted were new. He would mention that next time he needed her help. The rest of the afternoon was a wash. Will downloaded both books onto his tablet and brought them up onto his desk. He only had to read a small portion of each to predictably find Margot's recommendation to be far superior. He wasn't even sure why he had bothered with downloading the first book, but he enjoyed the satisfaction of proving her right. Or rather, proving that he had been right to ask her about it. Will closed the original text, then deliberately deleted the file. It felt good to free up the space. He often got annoyed sitting at his desk. The screen was so cluttered with unread papers and hastily jotted down notes of varying importance. He couldn't understand how it always became so messy when everything he actually used was on his tablet, which folded up neatly into his pocket. Still, at least he sat by the window. Will looked out onto the rows of labs and the building across the street. A mirror image. It wasn't a great view, but it was something. In the Jenner lab, every member from undergraduate intern to postdoctoral fellow had their own desk situated at the end of a long countertop, with shelves above and cabinets below for storage. Keeping desk work and experimental work adjacent meant higher productivity for everyone. And Will couldn't complain about the easy sidelong stride back and forth to confirm a data point or check on a forgotten sample. In the room where he worked, there were 5 such parallel constructs, lined perpendicularly along the window wall, where 10 lab members could set up camp, 1 on either side. John was just 1 row south of Will, and Jo worked directly behind him. Jenny technically worked in her own bay at the very end of the room, but she was so often asking advice that she seemed to work anywhere and everywhere she could. At the back of the lab were 2 hoods, 1 for working with tissue samples and 1 for more volatile chemicals. And at the front of the lab, there were 2 refrigerators, 1 for storing samples and 1 for storing snacks, though usually one or the other refrigerator was full. So often there was crossover. Will despised this negligent practice. It was bad enough they kept snacks in there at all. But he seemed to be the only one who gave a shit, so he never mentioned it. He wasn't going to be that guy in the lab. Will was waiting for a time slot on a thermocycler for the next step in his experiment, and waiting frustrated him. As he sat staring at his samples, George walked by, down the length of the room, shooting finger guns and throwing away words that were strung together to sound like sayings, but that were impossible to interpret. "Keep on lining them up, Joe," and "Don't waste a bucket in the rain, Jen." Despite archetypal academic eccentricities, George Jenner was at the top of his game, and he knew it. He wore an eyeglass chain and a pocket tee with confidence as he strode through the lab to his own tempo. Ingenuity is one size fits all, John. Don't try to use a fork as a spoon, Will." It reminded Will that he hadn't done the dishes in a week, and he had been stealing plastic utensils from the lunchroom to get by. He finished up some reading, and then went to get a drink with Joe at the bar called Bar. He ordered dinner as well, pizza topped with mashed potatoes and bacon. Will loved this pizza, not because it was better than any other pizza in town, but because it was particularly unwholesome and yet so widely popular, he didn't have to feel embarrassed about ordering it. He excused the meal because he needed to go back into lab afterward to finish up the experiment he had started that morning, and he wouldn't have time to eat at home. But it didn't stop him from finishing 3 beers. Will secretly hoped that John would be staying late in lab too, even though John would want to be home with his family. After a few drinks, he was sloppy at his bench. He left used test tubes and paper towels around the hood and spilled more chemicals than he ought to. But his samples were fine. He always paid close attention to what mattered most. Of course, he forgot to call Vicky as he promised he would to do most days. But it was already past midnight, and he hadn't finished his experiment yet. He would text her in the morning. That's the first chapter.
Wow, thank you. I mean, I used to work in a lab, so listening to you describe the centrifuges and the test tubes, and I was like, oh my God, it was like it was pretty much like that in the
Bringing
lab.
back bad memories.
Well, I remember lying on the floor one night. I stayed 24 hours to run these
Oh yeah.
blots. The bloody things just didn't work out. And I
Yeah.
remember being so scared. I'm lying there, and the janitor's going by. I was like, oh my God, I'm sleeping on the floor in a sleeping bag. But anyhow, it is
That
a
is,
long
yeah.
process. I think that's one of the reasons I didn't end up in research. I couldn't stand the waiting.
Yeah. No,
So,
that is one of the things that I wanted to write about was just how the lifestyle is just outrageous. Yeah.
yeah, and what you said about the competitiveness, definitely. I remember there was one guy, yeah, he did a PhD and he did a postdoc, and then he left academics to do, I guess, a clinical manager job. I remember his
Hmm.
supervisor was telling me she was so pissed off because she invested so many years in him, but he
Yeah.
decided to leave, and he was like, look, I don't speak English well. I'm an immigrant. Like, it's not like they're gonna hire me to teach at the university because I can't speak very
Hmm.
well. And he knew that. So he was like, it's okay, I'll do something else and at
Yeah.
least
It's such a
learn.
hard
Yeah.
decision after putting so much work in, but you have to decide what's right for your lifestyle and just so
Yeah.
much.
And I think I was a bit shocked at how little they were making even at a postdoc level. Like
Yeah.
after your PhD, it was like
Yeah.
30,000 or something. And that's Canadian. I guess American would be 20,000. Oh my gosh, it's like poverty
Yeah.
wage.
That.
So
And you
yeah.
have no choice about where you live or anything. It's, yeah.
Yeah, you have to go where the job is, right?
Yeah.
So, oh my gosh. Well, thank you for sharing your work and best of luck. And thank you
Thank you.
for coming onto our show.
Thank you for having me.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarage.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there is bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.